announcement before I start with the lesson, but with it being a holiday and the office being closed, I think that there are a couple of things that might have escaped our attention, and I don't know if they made the announcements this morning. Number one, Nita Graham, Wentz Graham's wife, passed away over the holiday, and that funeral will be tomorrow in Eastland at Edwards Funeral Home at 11 in the morning, visitation right before at 10 a.m. And also, I don't know if you're aware, but Brianna and Zinni Baeza had their little baby. I think it's Matthias. Is that how you pronounce it? Some of you young adults, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, but 7 pounds. I don't remember how many ounces, but doing well. Bouncing baby boy, and so that's exciting also. You know, the story is told of a gentleman who lived on top of the highest peak in his village. And one day he witnessed an earthquake down below. He felt the rumbling of the ground. He saw the people scurrying. And he noticed as he looked out across the sea, the tide was ebbing away from the shore, and he knew what was about to happen. As he looked out even further, he saw a great wall of water. It was a tsunami or a tidal wave that was heading straight for the village. And he had to get the people's attention because he didn't want them to perish in the wave of water. And so he tried to call out to them. He shouted. He did several things to try to get their attention, but nothing worked. And so finally, he did the only thing that he could think to do. He set his house and his barns on fire. And when the people smelled the smoke and saw the flames, they began rushing up the hillside in order to help him. And when they got to the top, they witnessed the entire village beneath them being wiped away by that tidal wave, and they realized what this man had done. This wealthy individual had sacrificed all that he owned in order to save the lives of his neighbors. Now, that story is not real indicative of what we see in our culture, is it? So often in our culture, we see selfishness persist. We see people looking out for number one and not always caring about what happens to everyone around them. Think about the different ways in which you see selfishness persist in daily life. People pulling out in front of you in traffic or weaving in and out of traffic in order to get to where they're going, or running stoplights or stop signs because they're in such a hurry, not caring about the danger that it puts others in. People stealing a parking spot away from you at the front of Walmart or wherever it may be. Marriages in shambles. The rudeness that you see in various places in our society. And of course, all sin. Isn't all sin in some way rooted in selfishness? Isn't all sin tied to the fact that we want to do our own thing rather than follow God's will? You see, a vast majority of Americans view life from this perspective. What's in it for me? And so life is about finishing first. Life is about being first place. Everything else is second place, and second place is for losers. Life is a drama about me, and everyone else are just extras in this drama about me. The only time that people really care, in my mind, the only time that I really care about people is if they can help me in some way get to where I need to go. Doesn't matter who you step on to get to the top, just get there, right? It's unfortunate, but we see this selfishness in our culture all the time. And the sad thing about it is selfishness can be rather subtle. Sometimes we can buy into it without ever really realizing what we're doing. We see small children who are selfish, but that's because they're born that way. They don't know any better. As they grow, they learn to be unselfish. They learn that the world doesn't revolve around them. But as adults, we're not much different. We're just a little more polished. And we can be just as selfish sometimes in smaller ways, in more subtle ways. We may delegate jobs that we feel are beneath us. Or we may walk by a piece of trash on the floor at work and we don't pick it up because that's the janitor's job, right? Or we park in a handicapped spot even though we're not handicapped ourselves because, after all, we're only going to be in there a few minutes, right? As I get older, I develop more pet peeves. Are you that way? One of my pet peeves now is people that walk their dog around our neighborhood and let it use the bathroom on our yard and don't pick it up. You know, that happens all the time in our world. Things like that are rather subtle. I don't think people even think about it anymore as being selfish. It's just so ingrained within us. Selfishness is so ingrained within us that we often don't even stop to consider our actions as being self-promoting. And you know, folks, we began 2013 by discussing ties that bind. And we talked about 10 attributes that were essential for a team to be effective. The church is a team. Oldham Lane is a team because a team is defined by a group of individuals, a collection of individuals who are united in a common bond and a common purpose. And that certainly defines us here at Oldham Lane. And so we talked about some things that make for a great team. And we're going to end this year much in the same way we started, but we're going to talk about things that are detrimental to the team. And certainly selfishness is one of those. Selfishness is a team killer. Sawyer read a moment ago from 1 Corinthians 10 and 24. Let no one seek his own good, but that of his neighbor. Romans 12, 3 and following states this, for through the grace given to me, I say to everyone among you, not to think more highly of himself than he ought to think. Further down in Romans 12, we read, bless those who persecute you. Bless those and do not curse. Rejoice with those who rejoice. Weep with those who weep. Be of the same mind toward one another. Do not be haughty in mind, but associate with the lowly. Do not be wise in your own estimation. Never pay back evil to anyone. Respect what is right in the sight of men. If possible, so far as it depends on you, be at peace with all men. Never take your own revenge, beloved, but leave room for the wrath of God, for it is written, vengeance is mine, I shall repay. But if your enemy is hungry, feed him. And if he is thirsty, give him a drink. For in so doing, you're heaping burning coals on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. Now, I believe Romans 12 is a treatise on selfishness. Might put a little bow on this chapter and just say that the main message here is it's not about you, right? I mean, that's really the message that Paul is sending here. In a nutshell, what he's saying is, it's not about you, folks. It's about the kingdom, and it's about how we can best serve the kingdom and be a functioning member of the team. Society teaches us selfish ambition. It teaches us to look out for number one at all costs. It teaches us that it is all about you, that it's all about serving self. But my friends, there is a high cost to finishing first. We have to understand that there is a price for self-promotion, something Jesus talked about very plainly in Matthew chapter 6. The disease of me is a debilitating illness. I don't have to tell you that the Scriptures teach a very different perspective on life. The Scriptures teach that we are to be selfless rather than selfish, that to be a functioning member of this team, to be the very best Christian that we can possibly be, to be the very best Christ follower we can possibly be, means that we die to ourselves, that we don't live for ourselves, but we deny ourselves and take up our cross daily and follow after Christ. Christ taught a very contrarian way to live in relation to society. Christ taught us that the way up is down. He taught us that you give in order to get. If you want the best seat in the house, you take the worst one. And if you want to live, then you've got to die. It's a very different way than our society teaches. But it's the only way to live if we are going to be kingdom dwellers. You know, one of the greatest distinctions between kingdom living and worldly living is that of selflessness versus selfishness. A lesson that two disciples were taught by Jesus himself, we see in Mark chapter 10, beginning in verse 35, these words. It says, James and John, the two sons of Zebedee, came up to Jesus saying, Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask you. And he said to them, what do you want me to do for you? And they said to him, grant that we may sit, one on your right and one on your left, in your glory. But Jesus said to them, you do not know what you are asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink, or to be baptized with the baptism with which I am baptized? And they said to him, we are able. And Jesus said to them, the cup that I drink you shall drink, and you shall be baptized with the baptism with which I am baptized. But to sit on my right and on my left, this is not mine to give, but it is for those whom it has been prepared. Now you may remember that in Matthew 19 and 28, Jesus promised that the apostles would sit on 12 thrones. And Jesus said to them, truly I say to you that you have followed me in the regeneration when the Son of Man will sit on his glorious throne. You also shall sit upon 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. Now, it may have been that James and John had this in mind when they came with their request. And since we're all going to sit on 12 thrones, then we want to sit on the most prominent ones, the one being on the right the most prominent, and the one on the left, the second most prominent. But it makes you wonder why these men would even ask this of Christ. How could they have the audacity to even ask this, much less expect Jesus to grant it for them, right? Well, we know that many people use different things for leverage. Many people think in our society that they have a privileged position because of who they are. You see, the family that we're talking about here, James and John, the Bible tells us, Mark 1:20, that their family had money. They had a connection to the high priest, as John 18:15 tells us. They were also a part of Jesus' inner circle, Peter, James, and John, right? So we could understand maybe if they were banking on their earthly position as a means for getting what they wanted. I've witnessed individuals who do this sometimes. Even within the church, people using their contribution as leverage. Well, I'm not going to give to the church here unless you give me what I want. That's sinful, but we see it all the time. We see it in the secular world, people banking on their prestige and their power to get what they want. And so maybe that was at play here. I don't know. But traveling in Jesus' company was the mother of these sons of Zebedee, Salome. She had come to Jesus with her sons, and she had added her appeal. In Matthew 20:21, we read of her request, which is, "Command that in your kingdom these two sons of mine may sit, one on your right and one on your left." Now, it's interesting to note that Jesus doesn't rebuke Salome. After all, she was a mother that just wanted what was best for her children. Maybe that's why he didn't rebuke her. I think as a parent, we can understand wanting what's best for our children, right? Some of you may have done the same thing. Maybe you've lobbied for your child to have a certain teacher in school, or maybe you've lobbied for your child to be on a certain athletic team because you felt it was best for them. So we kind of understand her request here. Salome didn't understand the nature of Jesus' kingdom. Though she and the other women had traveled with Jesus in Galilee, she had not been with him the whole time. But James and John had. They should have known better. They had no excuse. They should have understood the nature of this kingdom. But you see, James and John, we could say, were infected by something that's poisoned so many living in our day and age, that disease of me, right? Looking out for number one, selfishness in its simplest form. Those who seek a crown without a cross. Those who seek the glory without any pain. They want reward without paying a price. And it's an unfortunate reality that many people in our world today are more concerned with finishing first than with glorifying God. Power, position, prestige seem to be the primary pursuit of so many. And as a result, personal surrender never even enters into their mind. Never even comes on their radar screen. Surrender means defeat, as many people see it. And defeat means that you're a loser. Nobody wants to be a loser. Nobody wants to be seen as defeated or as somebody who has lost. We talk about submission when it comes to living this kingdom life. We don't like submission either. Submission means that I surrender, that I give up, that I lose. And in the end, we don't want that. But in Matthew 16:24, Jesus stated these words, "If anyone wishes to come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross and follow me." It was also Jesus who said this, "Whoever exalts himself shall be humbled, and whoever humbles himself shall be exalted." It's sad that pride has blinded so many people to this reality. Pride has caused so many folks to not see the blessing that comes from giving up, from submitting or surrendering one's life to Christ. My friends, the Lord's kingdom doesn't have any losers in it. None. In fact, in Jesus' upside-down way, he is telling us that if you want victory, you've got to first be defeated. You've got to defeat yourself. You've got to submit. You've got to surrender in order to gain the victory. I don't know about you, but what I find particularly bothersome about James and John's request is the timing of it. This comes just prior to Jesus heading to the cross. The cross is looming in the foreground, and yet these two are bickering over who should have the right to sit on his right and left. And yet, Jesus does accommodate their request, at least by not immediately shutting them down, but using it as an opportunity to teach. He says, "You do not know what you are asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink and be baptized with the baptism that which I am baptized? They said, we are able. And Jesus said to them, the cup that I drink you shall drink, and you shall be baptized with the baptism with which I am baptized. But to sit on my left and to sit on my right, this is not mine to give, but it is for those for whom it has been prepared. Now understand, Jesus is talking here about the suffering that he is about to endure. Cup and baptism are in the present tense here in the Greek language, and what that means is basically that he is about to be immersed in suffering. And he's asking him, can you endure this? And James and John, never lacking in confidence or courage, say, absolutely. Well, Jesus knew what they would endure. Unfortunately, he knew that they would suffer. He knew that John would die at the hands of Herod Agrippa in AD 44. He knew that John would be exiled to the Isle of Patmos. They would certainly come to understand what it means to suffer for the sake of righteousness. In Philippians 2, 3 through 5, Paul wrote these words, do nothing from selfishness or empty conceit, but with humility of mind regard one another as more important than yourselves. Do not merely look out for your own personal interest, but also for the interest of others. Have this attitude in yourselves, which was also in Christ Jesus. If only James and John could have understood this concept and grasped it. If only we, living in this day and age, could grasp it as well, that it's not about us. Scripture promotes just the opposite of selfishness. If you want to be a dedicated follower of Christ, then you must first and foremost be selfless. You must be done with yourself altogether. Selfishness and kingdom living cannot coexist. Selfishness often causes collateral damage as well. What happened when the others heard about James and John's request? They were indignant, right? They were angry that these two would go to Jesus behind their backs and request these places of prominence. We know that the 12 had this ongoing quarrel about who was the greatest in the kingdom. Jesus used this, as I said, as an opportunity to teach a lesson on greatness as it applies to kingdom living. Verses 42 through 45 of Mark chapter 10 read, calling them to himself, Jesus said to them, you know that those who are recognized as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great men exercise authority over them. But it is not this way among you. But whoever wishes to become great among you shall be your servant, and whoever wishes to be first, you shall be a slave of all. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. The term servant is a term that has been watered down and diluted in our culture. We have even made servant a word that promotes selfishness, haven't we? We've even seen service being applied to self and receiving the spotlight. And many times, people won't even serve if there's not something that they can get out of it. We talk about going and serving in some area, and we talk about how we did this and how great it was, and almost as if we're asking for people to praise us. But understand, that's not what the word servant here meant. Servant, as it applies in biblical times, is someone who is willing to perform the most menial of tasks, willing to do whatever is necessary to help another in need and not get credit for it. And yet, I've been in churches where I've been chastised because I didn't put a name in the bulletin for something that somebody did in the community or some sort of service work that they did. Why is my name in the bulletin? Why didn't you mention me from the pulpit? Where's my spotlight moment? Where's my 15 minutes of fame? That's not what service is, folks. Not according to the biblical model. Being a servant in the Bible meant that you were willing to wash feet if need be and not receive praise for it. But we see that the Bible uses another term that goes even further in depth, a term that we talked about last week, that term slave. Not only are we a servant, but we are a slave in the kingdom, which means that we have no rights whatsoever, that we belong to another. We have been bought at a price. We are no longer our own. You see, that word doulos, that Peter, Paul, John, Timothy, Jude, James, all refer to themselves as, that term bond slave or bond servant means that I was formerly a slave to Satan, but now I'm a slave to the Master who is Jesus Christ. I have given my life up. I have surrendered my life completely. I no longer have any rights whatsoever. In fact, I have disavowed myself altogether. I belong to another. I deserve nothing. I am His. Needless to say, the terms servant and slave, as we think about them today, are very off base from what the Bible sees those terms as, the identity of those terms. You cannot be a slave and be selfish. The two are totally contradictory to one another. You cannot be a servant and be selfish. You cannot truly serve if you're only wanting to know what's in it for you. You have been purchased by blood. You have been bought with a price. Someone redeemed you, and now you belong to them. Your life now must be spent in service, dedicated service to your Master. You cannot serve Christ while serving your ego. The two do not go hand in hand. You cannot be considered a slave while clinging to your will. This is not about you at all. This is about Christ, and it's about what we can do for Him and for others. Remember the words of Paul, I have been crucified with Christ, and it is no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. And the life which I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave Himself up for me. Die to your will. Crucify your old self. Stop thinking about what's in it for me. Open your eyes to the reality that you are a slave, you're not a master, you don't deserve anything. In fact, you are completely indebted to the one who redeemed you. And therefore, your life is spent in humble service to Him. It's not about the spotlight. It's not about what you can get out of the relationship. It's all about what you can give. And if more of us understood that as followers, we would have more dedicated Christians. This is not about you. We talk about that in church all the time. We've talked about it in our worship series on Sunday nights. But not only is the worship service not about you, this whole thing is not about you. And so when you come in demanding rights or when you come in demanding attention, you've completely missed the point of all of it. You are a slave. Christ is the master. He doesn't owe you anything. You owe Him everything. And if we want to be a successful team that understands what it means to live for Christ and live for others, then we have to start here. We have to understand how rampant selfishness is in our culture and how it so easily entangles us, and we've got to toss it aside. We've got to crucify our old self. We've got to die to ourselves and become a faithful follower through serving and through slavery. I think just about every church has a Brother Told'em. You know who a Brother Told'em is? He's that brother that stands at the back and he shakes the preacher's hand. He said, "You sure told them, brother." Now, so far you haven't reared yourself here. You haven't shown yourself here, but we may have one of those here. But everywhere I've been, you have a Brother Told'em. At the end of the service, he always comes up and says, "That was a great sermon. You sure told them." In other words, the sermon was never aimed at him in his mind. It was always for somebody else. And the story is told of this gentleman who was a preacher in a small congregation, and one Sunday they had inclement weather. And they had one of these Brother Told'ems that every Sunday would come up to the preacher and say, "You sure told them." Well, because this Sunday they had inclement weather, he was the only one that showed up. And so it was just the preacher and this brother sitting in the audience. And so the preacher thought, "I've got him right where I want him. There's no way he can misconceive this. I'm going to give the lesson, and he's got to see that it's aimed at him, that it'll hit him right between the eyes." And so he delivered this soul-stirring message, and he stood at the back, as was routine, to greet everybody that was leaving. In this case, it was just one person, and Brother Told'em went up to him. He shook his hand. He said, "That was a great lesson. Too bad the other people weren't here to hear it." And I think sometimes we can be the same way. We can miss the point that we can be so interested in everything else that is going on around us that we don't see past our noses. What Jesus was saying to James and John, He wasn't just saying to James and John. What Paul wrote to the Philippians, he wasn't just writing to the Philippians. That is for us as well. We benefit from that. Because what he wrote to the Romans, that's to us as well. Do nothing from selfish conceit. Look out for the needs of others. Consider where you stand in this relationship. You are a slave. Understand how poisonous and how toxic selfishness is. Pride is the number one thing that keeps people out of heaven. Understand that and live counter-culturally. Be a kingdom dweller. Don't buy into what the culture is selling. And maybe you're sitting here this morning and you have bought into what the culture is teaching. You are so ingrained with selfishness that you can't see past your own nose. You need help in understanding what it means to be a kingdom dweller, a kingdom liver. Maybe you need to talk with one of the elders or myself. We'd love to do that and study with you. Maybe you have become a Christian at some point in your life, and yet you've dug up that old self that you crucified a long time ago. You've exhumed that dead body, and you're trying to live in it again, and you need the prayers and support of this church family to get back on track. We want to help you there as well. And if you are not a child of God, and you have not put on Christ in baptism for the remission of your sins, then take care of that this morning. We need you on the team. You need to be in the kingdom where salvation is. Become a slave this morning. Come now as we stand and as we sing.